This is Undaunted.Life, a man's podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Thompson. Let's get into it. All right, guys, we are at the end of the year, as I just said in the last episode. So that means we're doing a bunch of wrap-ups. So today we are doing the best podcast episodes of 2022. That includes my show and also excludes my show. We're going to look at some stuff outside of that as well. But just want to remind you guys to keep us in mind for your end-of-year giving. Everybody's feeling the festivities and feeling the season. Well, guys, if you are a giver, if you like donating to things, we would ask you to donate to us because everything we do costs money. All the stuff we're going to be doing in 2023, which is going to be awesome, it all costs money. That is what makes the world go round. And so we need guys just like you that like this content, that like sharing this content, leaving positive reviews. We want you to hop on board and be a part of what we're building here so we can equip men around the globe to push back darkness. And also you can help yourself as well by helping people that support us. So I'm going to mention this on every episode this week, but we are also working with Origin Maine. So they make the best jiu-jitsu gis on the planet. They make hunting gear. They make work boots. They make all kinds of crazy, awesome stuff on the Origin side. And then on the Jocko Fuel side, which is also ran by the same company, they've got energy drinks. They've got protein powder, they've got creatine, they've got greens, which actually don't taste like a funky foot. And guys, they are working with us in a way to where you can try all of their great, amazing products that are made here in the United States of America and get it at a discount. So you can use the code UNDAUNTED at checkout. So there's like a little place where you can put the promo code or coupon code or whatever and just put UNDAUNTED in there. And that'll get you 10% off of your order at originmaine.com. That will all be in the show notes. So here we are with another award show episode. I'm excited to bring this to you. So this is how we're going to break it down today. We're going to look at some shows that are not my show, and then we're going to look at this show. So on the other shows, I'm going to give you some random kind of can't miss episodes, just kind of give you a menu, an a la carte of different things that you can check out whenever you have some more time to, add some stuff to your to-listen list. But then I'm also going to do my favorite new podcast. This is new to me, a favorite new podcast of 2022, the best podcast show overall of 2022, and then the best individual podcast episode of 2022. And then on my show, I'm going to do things in kind of a little bit of a split way because there's two main ways that I do podcasts. There's my normal solo episodes, and then there's my interviews, okay? And so I'm going to do a lot of different categories, and we're going to look at my interviews and then just regular episodes. So I'm going to do the hardest interview and the hardest episode to prepare of this year, the most offensive episode, which is just going to be one of my solo episodes, the most talked about interview and regular episode, the interview that I was most nervous about, the episode I was most nervous about, the audience's favorite interview and episode of the year, and then also my personal favorite interview and episode of the year. So if you want to get those favorites, make sure you stick around with us all the way to the end. But one little side note here, and I talk about this just about every time I talk about podcasts, I get people all the time like, man, it's crazy you listen to so many podcasts, because I do. I listen to well over 1,000 podcast episodes, individual episodes per year. And the number one way I'm able to do that, and I'll give you a lot of different ways, but the number one way is to listen at 2 times speed. Now, I just saw with the new Apple update, which I hate, the update, like everything is like out of place and all jacked up. But one thing that you can do in the Apple podcast player, which I know most of you are listening to this on, you can do 1.25 speed, 1.5 speed, 1.75 speed, and then 2 times speed. And then guys, for those of you that listen on Audible, I think you can go all the way up to like 4 or 5 times speed or something like that. But the thing about it is your brain can listen a lot faster than you think, because I don't even realize how fast this sounds until someone else is around. Like if I'm listening to it, solo in my truck or something like that, and then somebody gets in, I'm like, okay, this sounds pretty fast. But literally for the next week, if you're like a one-time speed person, and you know who you are, I know some of you individually, if you're a one-time speed person, just bump it up to 2 times speed and then listen to all the episodes and all the shows that you would normally listen to this week, and then just tell me what you think. Because again, you don't need to hear every single word enunciated in this slow, normal fashion. Because if I were to go up to 2 times speed and talk a little bit faster, you're still getting the general gist of what I'm saying, because that's what you need. You need the gist of what I'm saying, not all the individual words. Think of it like if you read a little bit faster, you're not remembering all the individual words within the paragraph. You're remembering the overarching, narrative or the overarching thought. Also, don't listen to crappy podcast, okay? I'm a very loyal guy, and when I start listening to a show, if a show is really good for a lot of years, and then when it starts, kind of go off the cliff a little bit, I'm going to stick with it because I'm loyal, right? But if a podcast sucks, like an overall podcast, but even an individual episode from someone that you like, mine included, if you're not feeling it, just skip it and move on. Like, feel no need. Like, I'm a finisher. I have to finish my plate. I have to finish the book. I have to finish the movie. Like, if you are not getting anything out of it, and there's no sense that it's going to change, just kind of go ahead and skip, and I guess move on to the next podcast after you get the point. So if someone, because I know that there are people out there that have long form podcasts and short form podcasts, and for whatever reason, these people are unbelievably verbose. It's like, yep, we got your point in the first 90 seconds of the podcast, but somehow you stretch this out into an hour and a half. Like, how in the world did that happen? Once you get the point, go ahead and move on. And also listen to podcasts every time you get an opportunity. One thing that I do is I've got my AirPods here basically in my pocket with me at all times. And so if I'm somewhere where I'm alone or I'm waiting for somebody or something like that, I'll just throw my headphones in and start listening to a podcast or a book, but it's, 95% of the time it's a podcast. So listen to it while you're walking the dog, listen to it while you're mowing the lawn, listen to it while you're cleaning the house and no one's around. Now, don't be the guy that's got your headphones in while you're sitting there with your family and everybody's trying to do family time. That's a little bit weird. Your entire family shouldn't have to, tell you 4 or 5 times a day, hey, can you please pause your podcast so I can talk to you? But just do it every chance that you get. Before we get into the awards as well, I'm also going to give you my lineup of podcasts because everyone's always curious of, what shows that I personally listen to. Now, I'm not going to put these in the show notes because I know you guys listen to these podcasts on all kinds of different platforms. And so it'd be silly if I gave you the Apple Podcast links or the iHeartRadio links whenever you listen on some other platform. So I'm just going to list them there so you guys can check it out. But also consider me mentioning these individual podcasts as an endorsement of these shows. But obviously, I don't fully support everything that's said by every single person on every single one of the episodes of each of these podcasts. Okay, because duh. Okay, but let me go and get into the podcasts that are new to me this year. So these are podcasts that I just started listening to this year. So the Church of 1122, those are the sermons from Pastor Joby Martin. Deepen with Pastor Joby Martin. So these last few episodes, he's been, interviewing people that are kind of doing stuff that's in line with what he's talking about in his sermon series, but it's him and some other guys just talking about his sermon series. Truth for Life with Alistair Begg. I just picked that one up like about a month ago. Thinking in Public with Albert Mohler. So that's Albert Mohler's kind of long form interview podcast. Real Men with Mark Driscoll. And then Grace to You Pulpit Podcast with John MacArthur. Now, here are the podcasts that I can't miss, don't miss, won't miss. These are the ones that the day they come out, I'm typically listening to the episode the day they come out, okay? So The Briefing with Albert Mohler, Cooper Stuff with John Cooper, The Ben Shapiro Show, Morning Wire, also by The Daily Wire, PragerU 5-Minute Videos, Fireside Chat with Dennis Prager, Bill Burr's Monday Morning Podcast, and Dan Carlin's Hardcore History. So Dan Carlin's is easiest because he releases like 1 or 2 episodes a year at this point. Now, here are some other ones that are consistent listens for me. I listen to almost every episode, but I don't catch them maybe right in line or something like that, but I catch almost every episode without skipping. The Terminalist Podcast with Jack Hart. That was one that was just basically going through as a behind the scenes of the 10 episodes of this year's release of the Terminalist series. So that was kind of like a truncated series type thing. Shepherd's Conference Sermon Podcast by Grace Community Church. So that was another thing that was just the audio from them. And so there's some Bodie Bacham sermons and stuff like that in there. And then they got the, one that I've talked about before, the World of War Crimes or War Crimes and Crises. That's with Holly McKay. So she's had a couple of different, iterations of the naming of that podcast, but that's Holly McKay's podcast. Just Thinking Podcast with Daryl Harrison and Virgil Walker. The Village Church. That's the sermons for Matt Chandler. The Matt Walsh Show from The Daily Wire. The Jordan B. Peterson Podcast. The Jocko Unraveling Podcast with Jocko Willink and Daryl Cooper. That's where they kind of look at some different historical things. And then The Breakdown with James Langford. That is from my senator here in Oklahoma, James Langford. And then here are the podcasts that I listen to kind of here and there. And so I may pick up one episode this month or, a couple episodes or something, just kind of here or there. The Joe Rogan Experience, The Chad Prather Show, Unashamed with Phil, Jason, Al Robertson, Unbelievable with Justin Brierly, Louder with Crowder, Hold These Truths with Dan Crenshaw, Jocko Podcast, Danger Close with Jack Carr, Mike Drop with Mike Ritland, The Way I Heard It with Mike Rowe, The Art of Manliness Podcast with Brett McKay, The Lex Friedman Podcast, and the Glenn Beck Podcast. So, yes, I do listen to a ton of podcasts, but am I missing any? Are there some that I definitely need to be listening to? After you heard all those, you kind of get a sense of my style and the stuff I'm into. So if there's something I'm missing, be sure to let me know. But we've made it this far into the podcast. Let's go ahead and get to some awards. So here's some from the other shows. Here's some random can't miss episodes. And again, I'm going to put this list in the show notes. So please do not try to jot this down as you're driving or something like that. But just save these for later. These are ones that I think would be worth your time. So from the Joe Rogan Experience, I've got 1895 with Matt Walsh, 1864 with Alex Berenson, 1857 with Seth Dillon, 1816 with Gad Saad, 1807 with Douglas Murray, 1805 with Mike Tyson, the JRE MMA show number 121 with Bobby Green, 1787 with Dakota Meyer, and 1769, that was the return of Jordan Peterson. Those are all certainly worth your time. Again, I'm not going to go through and give you individual things on each one of those. You can go and check them out and read the description, see if it's something that you like to listen to. Also, the Grace to You Pulpit podcast with John MacArthur. These are the ones that I would listen to from there. How to Resist the Devil Part 2, where he goes through Ephesians 6 verses 14 through 17 from December the 13th. From Darkness to Light, where he looks at Ephesians 5 from June 22nd. The Walk of a True Christian from Ephesians 4 from April 27th. And then Come Out from Their Midst and Be Separate, where he's talking about 2 Corinthians 6 from March 25th. Then I've got Truth for Life with Alistair Begg. His episode from December the 5th, 2022, God Gave Them Up, Part 2 is certainly worth your time. Mic Drop, Black Hawk Down, Major Jeff Strucker. That's from November the 27th. From Jocko Podcast, episode 357, Remember the Ramrods with Medal of Honor recipient David Bellavia. And then Real Men with Mark Driscoll. So he's got an episode called Real Men Slay the Dragon from November the 16th. And then Man, Own Your Identity from September the 15th. From the Jordan B. Peterson Podcast, episode 301, Politics, Tradition, and Vision with Newt Gingrich. From episode 291 with How to Combat Hedonism by Dr. Peter Kreft. And then episode 290 with Douglas Murray and Jonathan Pageau. And then from the Church of 1122, I'm going to send you all the way back to 2016. September 25th of 2016 was week 1 of a series called, it was basically a manhood series, and this one was called Where Have All the Good Men Gone? That series went on for a while, so I would suggest that you listen to all of those episodes back from 2016. Also, Unbelievable with Justin Brierley. There's a classic replay, Antagonistic Atheism with David Robertson and Mike Lee from May 31st. From Hold These Truths with Dan Crenshaw, Lies the abortion industry keeps telling you with Michael Knowles from May 23rd. From the Shepherd's Conference Sermon Podcast by Grace Community Church I talked about earlier, there's the two speeches that Vodi Bakum gave, and one was called Fault Lines, Critical Race Theory, and the other one was called General Session number 4, Gospel Clarity. That was actually one of the most blistering presentations of the gospel I've ever heard in my life, and those are from March the 11th and March the 9th respectively. And the PragerU 5-minute videos, How to End Systemic Racism from March the 11th. From the Village Church Sermons, A Gospel Call from February the 14th, and from the Glenn Beck program, episode 132, How Critical Race Theorists Justify Racist Discrimination from James Lindsay. So let's go ahead and pass out some awards. I keep saying we're going to do that, but here we are actually there. So I need to talk about my favorite new podcast of 2022. So again, this is new to me. This podcast has been around for a while. But this is the Church of 1122. So these are the sermons from Pastor Joby Martin. And so it's kind of one of those things, like you'll notice from a lot of the podcasts that I've added this year, a lot of them are Christian in nature. And so I'm trying to kind of get into the groove of finding some specific pastors, some things that I can listen to that will not only be, edifying, but also challenging. And I like to kind of have some newer guys that are in the fight, and then maybe some old heads that are, in the sage stage. And so what I've kind of gotten into is I've always had the Village Church sermons with Matt Chandler, and then he had all the crap that went down this year, and some of the sermon content has been a little wonky the last couple of years. But I listened to that one consistently when Matt Chandler was preaching. But then I'm adding the Church of 1122 and Joby Martin to that fold on kind of the younger guys that are still in the fight. And then on the old side, it's John MacArthur and Alistair Begg, those old heads that are been in ministry for decades and decades and decades, and are starting to pass on some of their favorite things. But the thing about the sermon series with Joby Martin, and I've talked about this before, and I certainly talked about this on the last episode when I gave him his book, If the Tomb is Empty, my almost best book of the year, is he's a mega church pastor by every available metric. His church is a mega church, but it is a church that is actually dedicated to discipleship and dedicated to changing the community around them to being the capital C church in a way that it was meant to be in the local community. And you don't get the mega church pastor softball sermons from a guy like Joby Martin. He's a guy that talks really, really fast, which I can appreciate. He's a guy that makes his point. He's funny. He's also engaging. And you also don't feel like you've wasted your time when you're done listening to the sermons. And so I know for a lot of you listen to some people where, man, the content is very squishy. It's very simple. And maybe that's where you're at in your walk. And good on you. Like I think I mentioned on an interview recently, like you don't get saved and immediately start listening to Paul Washer or John MacArthur. Like those are guys whose theologies are so, specific and regimented and things like that. So you may get in with somebody that's a little bit more on the chill side, that's a little bit more on the relaxed side. Now, the problem is if you stay there and listen to that person for 10, 15, 20 years. But that's kind of the cool thing about Joby Martin is he has a message that is applicable to a wide audience, but it's not going to make an experienced Christian, basically have to turn their brain off to enjoy it. So, favorite new to me podcast of 2022, The Church of 1122. Now, the best podcast show overall, in my opinion, of 2022 is Morning Wire by The Daily Wire. And so if you're not familiar with that, I think that started last year, but basically this is a 15-minute or less kind of wrap up of major stories that are happening in the news. So they typically do 3 major stories that they'll spend, 3-4 minutes on, and then they'll do kind of a quick hitters of sorts at the end of the episode. And then just this year, they started doing an afternoon update as well. And the reason why I like this show so much and why I think it's the best podcast show overall is because if you literally don't have time, so you do not have time to listen to 5 hours of Ben Shapiro this week, or 5 hours of Michael Knowles, or 50 hours of Glenn Beck, or however much programming he puts out in a week. This is where you can get an idea in 15 minutes, or if you listen at 2 times speed, 7.5 minutes. You can have a generalized idea as to what's going on. Now, the Daily Wire is, overtly conservative, but of all their shows and all their offerings, this is the one thing that they do that is not like dripping with conservatism. Because Ben Shapiro is going to be unapologetically conservative when he gives his commentary on any subject, whether in culture or politics. And you shouldn't be surprised by that. He's not hiding the ball from you. But every now and then you'll get an idea that they're presenting these stories from a conservative angle, but you can tell that the Morning Wire crew is doing everything they can to make sure that they are giving you a down the center idea as to what's happening. Now, you can also tell when they've moved from reporting the news to giving a little bit more commentary. And that's fine. It's the same thing that when you're watching a political opinion host, like maybe you're a Tucker Carlson person or a Don Lemon person or whatever, like you should have a pretty good idea when they've moved from reporting the news to giving you their opinion. And the thing about it is those opinion shows are like 3-4 hours out of their 24-hour news cycle. And so you should be able to trust them when they're just doing the news, but also trust that you're getting an opinion when they're giving it to you in that form during an opinion host podcast or rather live show. And so I think it's the best podcast for you guys to pick up this year because, again, it's going to give you the rundown of the things because the number of guys that I run into that just have no freaking clue what is happening in the world. And then they find that one story that they attach themselves to, but then the 99% of the rest of their week is, fantasy football and college recruiting classes and who's going to pick up who at the winter meetings for Major League Baseball. It's like, no, this is going to give you an idea what's happening and it's good for you. It's good for your soul. All right, now let's do the best podcast episode of 2022. Now, the Joe Rogan Experience has ended up on my best podcast list quite often on this particular segment, on this particular type of show, because he does these 3-hour-long interviews, 4-hour-long interviews with these really, really important people. And the episode he did with Jordan Peterson, episode 1769, could have easily won my award this year because that was Jordan Peterson returning after being really, really sick, right before he releases his next book. And it was a great, fantastic interview. I think it's well worth your time. But then I also wanted to give it to somebody different. And so I really wanted to give this to the podcast that I found maybe the most entertaining for me, and that's the Lex Friedman podcast, episode 328 with John Danaher, and it's called Grappling, Jiu-Jitsu, ADC, and Animal Combat. And so that is John Danaher, who is probably the greatest technical grappling coach of all time, maybe MMA coach of all time. But he and Lex Friedman for like 4 hours are doing a basically frame by frame breakdown of what Gordon Ryan did at ADCC this year and just destroying his competition and basically destroying everybody except for one guy that he beat by a lot of points, but he didn't actually submit. And so they spend a lot of time talking about that. They're looking at the screen and they're doing a breakdown of jiu-jitsu. They also get into like a 45-minute long discussion about who would win in a fight, like a grizzly bear, a lion or a gorilla and stuff like that. And so that's kind of interesting hearing them go back and forth. The reason why I didn't pick that as my favorite episode of the year is because it was way too technical. So if you're not a jiu-jitsu person, you're just not going to get it. And I mean, even if you've trained jiu-jitsu for about 6 months, like you're a terrible white belt, you haven't even got your first stripe yet or something like that, you can still get something out of a podcast like this. But if you're a jiu-jitsu nerd, like if you're a lifer, if you're a blue belt that trains 5 times a week or you're a purple belt and above, you are going to love this episode, but it would be one that I would suggest you watch on YouTube because, again, they are bringing in a lot of video. So those were close, but they didn't quite get it. But the actual winner of the best individual podcast episode of 2022, I'm giving it to the Lex Friedman podcast, but this is episode 260 with George St. Pierre, John Danaher, and Gordon Ryan, the greatest of all time. And so on this podcast is who I would say are the 3 GOATs in their respective categories, all there on one podcast. So you have George St. Pierre, the greatest MMA fighter of all time. You have John Danaher, who is very likely the greatest MMA, if not just grappling coach of all time. And then Gordon Ryan, the greatest jiu-jitsu athlete of all time, at least in no-gi. Some would argue across the board, but certainly in no-gi. And so it's very rare to find an interviewer like Lex Friedman who is very open to letting the person talk. He's very curious. He asks fantastic questions to just let people talk. But when you have people like this, like I would have enjoyed him doing a 3-hour interview with each of these guys individually. And certainly he's done that with John Danaher and things like that. But getting to hear all these guys talk was so interesting to me, especially if you understand and realize that John Danaher has been one of the primary coaches for both of these men. He's been the primary coach for Gordon Ryan, and for a large portion of George St. Pierre's MMA career, he was one of his main coaches. And so hearing the reverence with which GSP and Gordon Ryan talk to John Danaher, talk about John Danaher, everyone was very, very complimentary. But if you like MMA at all, if you like strategy at all, if you like game theory at all, if you like jujitsu at all, if you like just overall, watching smart people say smart things, like it is a very, very good episode. So that's another one that I would encourage you to watch on YouTube because you're getting all the guys right there kind of talking. I believe they were all in the same room. And I will put that in the show notes so you guys can check that out. But the best podcast of the year, Lex Friedman podcast number 260 with George St. Pierre, John Danaher, and Gordon Ryan. So now we need to get into this podcast, Undaunted.Life, a man's podcast, and we're just going to go ahead and get right into it. So the first one is the hardest interview to prepare of 2022, and that is episode 384 with Crispin Mayfield, Attached to God. So as I talked about on the last podcast where I gave out my worst book of the year award, it was to Crispin Mayfield. But something I didn't talk about that on podcast that I do want to talk about on this one is when I'm pitched a book by a reputable source or publisher or publicist or individual that I'm working with in the marketing department, I will always take that seriously. I will read the pitch, and if I see enough there in the introduction or in the description, I'll go ahead and just say, yes, let's go ahead and schedule it and go from there. But I'm typically, especially with last year, or I guess we're still in this year, 54 books being read, like I'm not reading books months in advance before the interview. I'm booking these interviews months in advance, but I'm not reading the people's books. And so typically I find something redeeming in the book that it's like, okay, these parts of the book were kind of boring, or I didn't really get it, or I didn't really agree with it. So we'll focus on these parts so that we can have a good conversation. But I was so overwhelmed with the things that were just heretical and awful from Crispin Mayfield's book. And so it's the only interview that I honestly considered and talked to important people in my life about canceling the interview, which I hate doing. Because if I say I'm going to be there, Tuesday at 8 a.m., I'm going to be there Tuesday at 8 a.m. unless something horrific has happened to me or someone in my family. And I can count on one hand the number of times I flake or don't make it on time to something in an entire year. It just doesn't happen for a guy like me. And being a day or two out from an interview and, that person can't get that hour back, and now they got to, move their schedule around, and this is their release week, and it's a big, busy week for them. And so the reason why it was the hardest interview for me to prepare is because I didn't know how to approach it where I wasn't just going to come off being combative or just asking him these angry questions this whole time and like, how could you possibly say something like this? You're a moron. And so it took me a lot of settling down of my mindset. It took a lot of finagling and philosophizing as I'm putting the questions together. While the interview was going on, I was trying to remain, take the temperature of the room. And again, go back to at least the introduction of episode 284 and kind of look at that, because I give you, a peek behind the curtain. I thought the interview went incredibly well. So imagine my elation moving to, a negative, disappointed surprise when he flames me online right after the interview. But it was a very, very hard interview to prepare. But as I look back on the interview and as I listen back to that interview, there's nothing I would change about it. I think that I was fair. I pushed in a polite but persistent manner, but very, very hard interview to prepare for. So that's what I consider to be the hardest interview to prepare for 2022. Now, the hardest episode to prepare of 2022 is no shock to anyone that's listening to the show this year. That is episode of 338. It's called Sergeant CJ Nelson Goes Home. And so for those of you that are potentially new to this show, Sergeant CJ Nelson was my first cousin who was killed while in the line of duty this year for the Edmond Police Department here in Oklahoma. An absolutely devastating thing for my entire family. It's very hard for me to think about, to even look through. And it's one of those things where I was like, okay, I probably shouldn't talk about this on the show, but it was also one of those things the level of outreach to people that have been in a similar position to me and my family, and being able to say some things on that podcast that would be comforting to those people, that made it, totally worth it talking about it on the show. But very, very hard episode to prepare. It was a hard episode to get through. I was in tears within, I guess, 30 seconds into that show. That was an absolute rough one. Easily the hardest episode to prepare of 2022. Now we need to go to the most offensive episode of 2022. That was episode 377. It's called YouTube Censoring Us, Banning Pit Bulls, Tears from Jordan Peterson, and more. So I talked obviously about a lot on that particular episode. That was right after we had been censored from YouTube for something that they didn't explain to us, and I get into all that detail. But with all the stuff I talk about on the show, I talk about abortion, I talk about LGBTQ stuff, I talk about transing of the kids, I talk about pedophilia, I talk about illegal immigration, I talk about all these hot button issues, things that are impossible to talk about without making a lot of people very, very angry. But as I predicted, no one was more angry with me than whenever I talked about banning pit bulls, the dogs. And again, go to that episode. I think it was at the end where I started talking about the pit bulls or whatever. But this was coming on the heels of a story of this mother who had, I forget the ages, so I'll probably mess it up, but it was like a 4-year-old girl maybe, and then like a newborn, right? So a newborn boy. And their pit bull that they had owned since the time it was a puppy, and it was like 7 or 8 years in this household, just snapped and mauled the little girl to death, mauled the newborn baby to death, and almost killed the mother. The nurses in the emergency room that were patching this woman up, they said they stopped counting the number of stitches because there were so many. Think these are people these are ER nurses. Like they count stitches all the time. They said they basically lost count because they were basically doing all they could to stitch this woman back together. Right. And so I went into all the detail in that podcast about where pit bulls come from, what they were bred to do, how they're essentially way too dangerous for anyone to own in polite society, and how we should eradicate the breed. And so if you're a pit bull person, if you grew up with pit bulls, or if you own pit bulls, obviously people felt personally offended. And it's shocking that these people are personally offended whenever I say that their dog is too dangerous to own, and yet they want to lecture someone else about the pains of some other political issue, right? About illegal immigration or abortion or all these different things. And it's like, there's essentially one dog breed that is killing people here in the United States, and you're so just overwhelmed with the fact that it's your dog that you don't want to realize that is a dangerous, that's basically a wild animal. Like you wouldn't let a coyote live in your household, much less something bigger that could, destroy your family and tear them into pieces. And yet you own pit bulls and you have little kids. And so the one thing, again, go listen to that episode if you want to get more information. But if you have kids, obviously, if you have a pit bull, like you're literally playing with fire, you might as well put rattlesnakes in your kid's room because obviously you really don't care about them. But at the same time, if you are a parent that is concerned about dangerous dogs mauling your kid to death, you need to make sure you have a conversation with parents that are living in homes that you're sending your kids over to go play for a myriad of reasons. Right. You need to know, like, hey, is there an older brother that is going to be around, and is your little daughter going to be there? You need to know stuff like that. You need to know if they have their computers locked down. Are they monitored and looked at, or is it free reign with the internet? But also you need to know what kind of dogs they have. Because if they have a pit bull, a Rottweiler, or a Doberman, those are the 3 dogs essentially that kill 100% of the people every year that are killed by dogs. You can't send your kid to that house. Sorry, can't do it. But there you go. That was my most offensive episode of 2022. Now we need to get into my most talked about interview of 2022, and that was episode 367 with Gary Thomas, Making Your Marriage a Fortress. So this one is still getting a ton of downloads and listens and shares and things like that. But the thing with Gary Thomas is he writes books for the generalized marriage audience in the Christian space. And he's written a lot of books that are kind of in that vein, and Making Your Marriage a Fortress is another one of the things that are in that vein. But the reason I think that made this particular episode so talked about, and, questions I would get and questions I would field in DMs or emails, is because I asked him questions that he's not normally getting. I asked him, what is a healthy amount of times for a couple to have sex during the week? I asked him a lot of questions that were very pertinent to my male audience, because that is the overwhelming majority of my audience. But even he, after the interview was over, he was like, man, you just asked me anything that you wanted. And he goes, I freaking love that, because I'm not answering the same 10 questions about my book that I always have to answer, but it's like we're digging into real stuff. And I was like, yeah, absolutely. And so that obviously lent its way to you guys, because that is the most talked about interview that I got from this year, episode 367 with Gary Thomas. Now, the most talked about individual episode of 2022 is episode 315, Standing on the Bodies of Murdered Kids in Order to Take Your Guns. So this was after the tragedy in Uvalde where 19 children were slaughtered and then 2 adults, the teachers, were slaughtered. And just a horrible, horrific situation for just about anybody that was looking onto that. Obviously, no one, whether you're pro-gun, anti-gun, was excited about what happened. There's a lot of fault to go around, certainly with the police department and those cowards that just basically let those kids be murdered while they sat there getting hand sanitizer in the hallway. It was just a complete failure on a myriad of areas. But before the kids' blood could even dry on the floor of their classrooms, you had people basically saying, hey, we need to not only just ban AR-15s, we need to ban all weapons. This stuff will keep happening, blah, blah, all these different things. And so that particular episode, that's kind of my magnum opus on the gun issue, because not only do we break down what happened in Uvalde, but then we break down as Christians, why should we stand on scripture when it comes to self-defense? Because you'll have, people that don't know anything. They'll say, well, Jesus said to turn the other cheek. And they don't know the context of why he said that. They'll also say, he rebuked Peter when, the dude, he cut off that Roman soldier's, ear or whatever. Like, and yes, all that's true. But why did he rebuke him? That's an important thing that I dig into in that particular episode. But then I basically looked at all of these things that people take as fact that are essentially myths with the gun debate. And so even people that are pro-gun have bought into a lot of these myths in the gun debate. And so I debunk all of those in episode 315 of that podcast. Again, that was a banger. I think that was like an hour and 15 or hour and 20 minutes. So the most talked about episode of 2022, episode 315, standing on the bodies of murdered kids in order to take your guns. All right, next one here is the interview I was most nervous about of 2022, and that is episode 365 with John Lennox. Can science explain everything? So if you don't know who John Lennox is, you have not been in the Christian space for very long. He's basically on the Mount Rushmore of Christian apologetics. This is a guy that is a tremendous mathematician and scientist, and he's written so many things in this space. He's debated all of the new atheists that you would know, and he's done so with incredible grace, but also incredible intellect and drive and levity. Just a great guy to watch from afar and be a fan of. And then whenever I got connected with him to bring him on the show, I was so excited, but I was immediately nervous because I was like, this dude's a lion when it comes to this kind of stuff. And then a couple of months, maybe 6 weeks before the interview, I heard that he had a minor stroke. And I was like, gosh, that's terrible for him. I know he's working on a lot of things right now. Hopefully he can get that done. Hopefully the stroke is not a horrible thing for him. And the thing about it is I emailed him a couple of weeks before the interview and I said, hey, we still have this interview on the books, but obviously I know you just had a stroke. I'll let it be up to you. But dude, I completely understand if you want to reschedule for later or just cancel it or whatever. And he responded almost immediately and was like, no, we're going to do this. Like I'm very much so looking forward to it. And then we did. And again, with a guy of that level of intellect, I felt like all my questions were like lesser than, you know what I mean? And I'm trying to do my normal thing and my normal cadence and my normal voice, but I was very nervous about that one. I wanted, I guess it's like, I wanted him to like me. I wanted him to think, that I could write my name and walk and chew gum. But at the same time, I knew that this may be the only opportunity I ever get to talk to him. So I wanted to make sure it was a high quality product. And I got to say, I was very, very satisfied with how the interview turned off or turned on to the audience and how most people's questions for me afterwards. I was like, yes, like this is the exact response that I would have wanted. But again, I was very, very nervous about that interview. So that was clearly the interview I was most nervous about of 2022. And that's 365 with John Lennox. Excuse me 1 second. Got to take a drink. The thing is if you get the hottest tea possible and then you have to take a quick drink in the middle of the podcast, you burn your entire esophagus like I just did. But hey, let's keep moving forward. Next one here, the episode I was most nervous about from 2022, and that's episode number 400, Beware of the Dark-Eyed Interviewer. So that's from just a couple of weeks ago. And so, earlier I talked about the hardest interview to prepare for, and that was with Crispin Mayfield because all that nonsense. But then the recent thing, which again, I'll let you guys go to episode 400 of this podcast to look into it. But Ryan George was on this show a couple of weeks before that. We did an interview. I didn't really want to do the interview. I didn't think the book was any good. I actually thought it was pretty terrible. But, I'd already said I was going to do it. I was going to honor my commitment. I get into all that detail in that episode. But the reason why I was most nervous about that particular podcast is because coming back at Ryan George, because for those of you that don't know, he flamed me online, for his own fodder, for his blog after the interview was done. He had major problems with me beforehand, but he didn't address any of those with me directly. And then he just used me and used my audience so that he could sell books, which, if you guys bought the book, man, you bought it hook, line, and sinker. All right. Have fun with that paperweight. But at the same time, I was nervous about how to approach, putting him on blast for all the nonsense that he said about me afterwards that he thought he could get away with. And it was like, okay, is my pride, bubbling up here? Am I just, wanting to crush this guy? But I eventually, after, taking the opinions in of not only my wife, but, my advisors here and things like that, it was like, okay, letting this alone. This is not the same thing as a troll on Instagram or some random person that sends me a nasty email. This is a guy that literally was using me and using my audience to make money, and then decided to flame me later so that he could use it for content for his blog for people that follow him, which, pray for those people. But at the same time, I was like, I just can't let that stand. And I wasn't going to let that happen. But I was nervous about this podcast because I wasn't wanting to go in there like, oh, I'm going to destroy this guy and I'm going to show my dominance as he's so scared of, or something like that. It was like, I want people to get something out of my interactions with Ryan George. I want this to be an edifying thing for other people so that if they're in a similar position to me or to him, that they can operate accordingly. But it was the episode I was most nervous about of 2022, episode 400, Beware of the Dark-Eyed Interviewer. All right, now we're getting to some of the biggest awards of this year, and that is, we're going to get to this one now. So, audience's favorite interview of 2022. So I'm doing this one strictly based off of the amount of downloads of an individual episode. Okay. And I know it's not all created equal because some interviews, came out a month ago, some came out 12 months ago, but this, within general reason, this one was kind of far and away ahead of all the others. So the audience's favorite interview of 2022 was episode 361 with Owen Strachan, Christianity and Wokeness. And so he and I had a good interaction. He and I had a lot of fun. And we spent a lot of time engaging on his book from 2021, Christianity and Wokeness. And again, the questions that I'm going to ask these guys are not going to be the common questions that they get asked all the time. And you could even see at one point, he, at the early in the interview, he's obviously, he's excited to be there, but you never know what you're going to get from an interviewer. But then, about a third of the way, halfway through, he's like, okay, let's get after it. Like, I'm really enjoying these questions. And you guys apparently had a lot of fun with that, and you shared it around a ton. And so it was clearly a chord that was struck with you guys. But the thing about that interview, the thing about that book is there are a lot of Christians out there, there are a lot of conservatives out there that like to lament wokeness, but they don't understand what it is. They don't understand where the word woke comes from. Like the actual word that is used in kind of this modern political parlance way. But having somebody break it down, not only in his book, but certainly in the interview, breaking down why we got to this point, how long ago it started, but also how we can do things in the future, that's the one that you got to pay attention to, because there's a lot of people that can describe the problem. Well, I say a lot of people. Most people can't describe or prescribe anything. But if people are able to do anything, they can describe the problem. Here's what's happening, and here's why I don't like it. But then they can't go to that next level, which is prescription, to prescribe something. This is how we should fight back against it. This is how we should make changes. This is how we should make adjustments. This is how we should push back against that darkness. Owen Strachan can do both of it. He certainly did that in the book, and he did it on episode 361 of this podcast. Again, that is the audience's favorite interview of the year, episode 361 with Owen Strachan. All right, now we need to get into the audience's favorite episode. So this is the individual episode that they found the best. And this was another one that I just did strictly based off of downloads, and that was episode 271, Ways to Avoid Being a Crappy Man in 2022. And so as I talked about in that podcast, I'd done it, I think in 2018, 2019, or I did it like 2019, 2020, and then I took off 2021 for some reason, but then I brought it back. That is my first solo episode of the year. It's called Ways to Avoid Being a Crappy Man. And if you're into that, wait about another week, and then you're going to get the 2023 installment of it. But these are just basically quick pieces of advice that if you just do these things, you will not be a crappy man that year. Now, there are other things that you should avoid doing and that you should do and all that. It's certainly not an exhaustive list, but these are things that are very, very simple, practical things that you can do to avoid being a crappy man. And the thing about an episode like that, not only is it well received, not only is it well downloaded, well shared, obviously, because it was the most downloaded episode that we had, that was on the just regular episode side, but it's a practical thing for guys. I know that there are guys out there that every year they will wait until the list comes out. They'll type it up. And then, because I don't like put it in the show notes because I want you to actually listen, they'll type it up and they'll like print it out and put it on their mirror where they get ready in the morning, or they'll put it in their truck, or they'll do something with it, put it in their notes on their phone. And it's just a reminder that if I check these boxes, and some of the boxes are going to be really easy to check for some of you guys, and other ones won't be as easy to check. Some of those are going to be real bugaboos for you, but it's something that's very, very important. And I'm very excited for 2023's episode because I have a lot of the same ones, because a lot of this advice, I'm just going to give it to you every year just as your reminder. But then there's some new things that it's like, hey, I'm adjusting this to kind of more focus on this particular area, but it's always been very well received. And the first time I recorded, I think in 2019, I was a little nervous, because people are like, wait, you're being super judgmental. So if I don't do the things that you say, Mr. Podcaster guy with your beard, then I'm a crappy man. It's like, well, yeah. It's like, you're just getting mad that I'm saying you shouldn't do it, but you're not also making the argument that you should be able to do all these things, right? But it's just one of those things. It's an easily shareable one that you can share around. I think I have 17 ways in the upcoming episode for how you can avoid being a crappy man. That's if I don't think of any others, but that is the audience's favorite episode of 2022, episode 271, Ways to Avoid Being a Crappy Man in 2022. All right, now I'm going to do my favorite interview of 2022. But before I get there, I am going to do some honorable mentions. And guys, for the most part, like, I just basically scrolled through from January to last week, and I looked at the interviews I had done. This is certainly not an exhaustive list. There are interviews that I did that were amazing, that I really, really enjoyed, but I can't sit here and just list off, 70 interviews or however many we did this year. But these are the ones that it's like, okay, if you want a short list of ones that I think will give you a good broad spectrum view of the people that we had on this year, that's the honorable mentions. Okay, so I'm going to do it in descending order. So episode 401 with Mike Lynn, episode 398 with Sean McDowell, episode 392 with Bert Soren, episode 353 with Chad Prather, episode 280 with Phil Robertson. I said these were in descending order and they're all over the place. Sorry. Episode 317 with John Eldridge, episode 316 with Tim Kennedy, episode 307 with Joby Martin, episode 287 with Dakota Meyer, episode 285 with Michael Easter, episode 282 with John Tyson, episode 276 with Samuel Say, and episode 270 with Holly McKay. So those are all great. Those are all certainly worth your time and attention if you haven't listened to those, because I know we've gotten a lot of new listeners here even in the last several months. Just go and listen to those. But my winner for the best interview, or my favorite interview of 2022, was episode 370 with Sarah Wilkinson, The Wake of Suicide and Grieving Well. And when I first thought, because throughout the year, I'm thinking about these award shows. As I'm reading books, as I'm listening to podcasts, I'm thinking about my wrap up, year-end wrap up, the things I'm going to talk about. I'm always kind of keeping track in my head and keeping score of like, what are the things that we're talking about, or the people we're talking to that are going to stand the test of time. Things that, 10 years from now, we can drop in, listen to this episode, and that interview is still going to make sense. That podcast is still going to make sense. That book's still going to be applicable. The thing with this interview is Sarah Wilkinson, for those of you that don't know, she was married to a guy named Chad Wilkinson, who was in the development group, which is the highest tier of the United States Navy SEALs, and he killed himself. And I think that was back in 2018, and it was a shock to everyone, but he had, some blast damage in his brain, and he had some mental breaks that were going down. He was doing a lot of things towards the end that didn't really make sense to people, certainly not to Sarah Wilkinson, who was his, high school sweetheart. And the thing about this interview, and I don't think I said it in the intro, maybe I did, excuse me, but I always prepare my notes for these interviews as if the person is only going to answer what I ask them, right? Now, almost all of my interviews start to weave and we get this narrative and I can skip around and it's great. It's great fun. But when she got on the call for that day, like I could tell she was sad, and, we were doing this before the Chad 1000X workout, which is the workout that the CrossFit community and GoRuck has kind of put together, where it's a 1,000 box step ups. And part of this is to kind of push people to that workout so that they'll register for the workout, so they'll do the workout and all that kind of stuff, and bring awareness to suicide prevention and all of that. And so she was going to do the interview, but I could tell she didn't want to. She was so sad. And she basically, this is off air, she's like, today's just not a good day. And that's the thing, whenever you have a widow or a widower or someone that's grieving the loss of a loved one, is some days are better than others. Like a lot of the days kind of suck, but some days just really suck. And this was one of those really suck days for Sarah. And I basically put the ball in her court and I said, well, basically we don't have to do this. I know you want to do this, because that's one thing I told her off air as well, is like, I know you don't want to talk to me, because it would be better if she and I didn't even know each other existed, because if that were true, that means Chad's still here, right? Because she was, a supportive military spouse, but also a business owner doing her own thing over there on the East Coast. And, she shouldn't know a guy that runs a podcast out of Edmond, Oklahoma. She shouldn't know me, but she does. because of what happened and because of what she's done subsequently. And so basically what we did from the beginning, she's like, look, I don't want to talk about the day Chad died. I don't want to talk about all these different things. And those are a lot of things that I was going to talk about. And so I said, you know what? Fine. I X'd out of my notes for the interview and just flowed. I said, Sarah, if it's okay with you, I just want to hit record. Let's just talk for an hour and see where it goes. She goes, okay, let's get it. And that's what we did. And I think in the first 2 minutes, we're both crying, right? Because it's still, fresh, the death of my cousin who was killed while on duty, obviously, different than suicide, different circumstances and all. Yeah, I get it. But we just flowed. And I remember the whole time it's happening, because it's a little bit of an out-of-body experience because I don't have my notes, and those are kind of, my safety blanket, if you will, and things like that. And I'm wanting to probe into certain things not because I'm voyeuristic and just want to see her be emotional, but because I know that her answers are going to help people that are listening to this, right? We've talked about on this show, we've had guys from my foxhole. We had one guy in particular, Landon, that took his own life. And it's like, she's going to say something that's going to help somebody. I know it. She's going to say something that could potentially keep someone from taking their own life, or get them to say the thing that's going to help the person in their life that is having a mental problem or a struggle or something like that. And so by the time our time was over, I just X'd out of it. I have a little chat with her afterwards because I know she needs to go, and I want to get her to go. We pray together, and then, I just send her on her way. And it was one of those things that as soon as I was done, I was like exhausted from the interview in a good way, because it was like, this is so important. Like, there's something here to this conversation, and I don't want to be hyperbolic about it, but like, this is a big conversation, and it's a conversation that she's had before. She's been on other big shows. She's talked to people about this type of thing. And, certainly I'm no different, but I did ask questions from a little bit of a different perspective, different point of view, as you guys know, if you've been listening to the show for any length of time. But I was just so happy that Sarah stayed in the pocket, that she showed courage and resilience in that moment to just do the interview, and just to be so unbelievably honest and forthright about it. It's just, that's the stickiest interview of this year. It just sticks in my brain. And guys, we've had some monsters on this podcast this year, some incredible people. Again, I mentioned them earlier when I was giving out the awards, and then I had my honorable mentions as well. But if there's one interview, it's almost as if I could just if I had to delete all the other interviews I did this year and leave one for humanity, it would be episode 370 with Sarah Wilkinson, called The Wake of Suicide and Grieving Well, which was my favorite interview of 2022. And then now we're going to get into my favorite episode of 2022. So this is a non-interview. So here are a couple of honorable mentions. So episode 380, Ode to My Father. That was an ode to my dad, who had just retired from 40 plus years in a factory job, and how much I appreciated what he did for me while growing up. Episode 334, Jordan Peterson's message to Christian churches. Episode 315, which I've already mentioned, standing on the bodies of murdered kids in order to take your guns. Episode 299, called Squish Thompson. So that's the episode that I did after our second son was born, that we named Squish kind of by accident. You can go back to episode 299 to get the reason for that. And then also episode 279, which was called Purple Belt. That was back from January, where I did the episode right after I was promoted to Purple Belt in Jiu-Jitsu. But if I had to pick one episode for this year that is my favorite one of the year, it is episode 324. It's called Praise God, Roe v. Wade is Dead. And so, as I described in this particular episode, we'd already gotten the leak for the draft opinion, from Alito's draft opinion, that Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood v. Casey were on the ropes and potentially going to be taken out. And so I knew the decision was going to be coming down. This was in June. And I'm just like, I know the decision's coming down at some point, but I still got to live life. I can't just wait around on my phone. And so I'm literally on my lawnmower, mowing our lawn. And, I'm in camo. I got my big ridiculous hat on, and, I'm covered in sunscreen and all that because I'm ginger. And then I get a call from Brandon, one of the guys in my foxhole. And he's basically like, dude, can you believe it? And, I was looking at his text messages, and then I called him, and it was overturned. Roe v. Wade had been overturned. I didn't do any prep for an episode because I'm so pessimistic. I was like, I don't want to prep an episode about Roe v. Wade being overturned and then record it as soon as it's, is released, and then it's not overturned. I didn't want that to happen. And so I literally leave my lawnmower in the middle of the backyard, and I run upstairs, and I hop into the studio, and I get my notes, and I, jot some things down, and I basically just float. I don't even know how long the episode ended up being, but I'm sitting there in my long sleeve shirt and all that. I think I've got like a sunburn line, and I'm sweating, and I'm covered in dirt and different things like that. But I had to get my thoughts out as quickly as possible before I went back to the rest of the stuff in my day. And man, I got overwhelmed with emotion early in that podcast, because it's like, I've been in the pro-life fight for a very short period of time compared to some people. because there were people that started the pro-life fight back in the early 70s when Roe v. Wade became the pseudo law of the land, as it were. And there were probably tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people that had died in those subsequent 40 years that didn't get to see that day. But we did. We got to see the most damnable, murderous ideology, judicial ideology, go by the wayside, which didn't end the fight between pro-abortion and pro-life, as you've clearly seen since then with a lot of these state questions, with some people that were not elected, that should have been elected, with all these different things. But I believe I saw somewhere back in October that from like June to October, they did some data, crunching and things like that. And they had come to determine that just with the overturning of Roe v. Wade and some of these trigger laws going into place and these new pro-life laws going in these pro-life states, that over 10,000 babies had already been saved from June to October that we know of. 10,000 plus human beings are going to get the right to live outside of their mother's womb because of what those people did, what the SCOTUS did. And so it's my favorite news story, to kind of allude to what we're going to talk about later on this week. It's my favorite news story of the year. It is the biggest news story of the year. That's one of those moments. That's one of those days. That's one of those experiences that you should remember where you were when you heard the news. Because I remember where I was when I heard the news about the Politico leak. I was up here in the studio, like preparing an episode. But then also, I'll never forget how I felt and how everybody felt, and just the elation from the pro-life community, which is mainly made up of Christians, that they were just so satisfied that had finally happened, that horrific decision was overturned, and we got the overturning of Roe v. Wade. So my favorite episode of 2022, 324, praise God, Roe v. Wade is dead. All right, guys, there is a breakdown on my best podcast, for my show and the other shows of 2022. But before we let you go, we are going to do a quick resilience boost. At Undaunted.Life, our mission is equipping men to push back darkness with content that forges spiritual, mental, and physical resilience. So I've got the link to the Origin website. So again, guys, go check out the full line of Origin and Jocko Fuel products. That's geese, jeans, boots, hunting gear, energy drinks, supplements, and a whole lot more. Use the promo code Undaunted to get 10% off your order. Now, in terms of the show notes here for today, let me just kind of explain these. So I got a link to our donation page, right? So those of you wanting to do end of year giving or starting to do the monthly giving, you can go there. I've got the YouTube link to George St. Pierre, John Donaher, and Gordon Ryan, the greatest of all time, Lex Friedman podcast 260. So you guys can check that out. But then I've just got like a list. So all the random can't miss episodes that I listed earlier, my favorite podcasts, the stuff from this show. I'm not going to do links to all those things because that would just be like egregious. And I honestly don't want to sit there for like an hour putting all these links in there, but I'm just going to put the text in there so you guys can see that. And if you're on my website or even in the app looking and you see like, oh, Kyle was talking about episode 316 with Tim Kennedy, you can just easily scroll through from whatever episode you're on now, 405, and then go back to whatever episode that I was talking about if it's within this feed. And then also you're listening to me on whatever feed you listen to podcasts. So if I'm mentioning another podcast and you're like, oh, I want to check out, the Church of 1122 podcast, just check it out right there. I believe everything that I listed, all the podcasts that I listed, are available on all platforms. So Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Podbean, everywhere else. So you guys can check those out. Doesn't matter. It's going to be awesome for you. Thank you guys for listening to this episode. Wherever you're listening to this, please subscribe, rate, and leave us a positive 5-star review. If you want me to come speak live at your event or on your podcast, just shoot me an email to info@Undaunted.Life. That's info@Undaunted.Life. Follow us on Instagram and like us on Facebook, and check out our website for everything else, including how to donate to keep more content like this coming your way. Just go to www.Undaunted.Life. And as always, we want to thank the band August Burns Red for allowing us to use their music for our content. The music on this podcast is our song Cutting the Tides, which is off their 10th anniversary re-recording of their album Leveler. The links are in the description. I'm your host, Kyle Thompson. Remember, keep pushing back darkness, keep forging spiritual, mental, and physical resilience, keep seeking the Lion of Judah.